All right, this is chapter of Russia related to World War I. All right, so Russia withdraws, Russian Revolution. And looks like we got some amazing vocab. So the question is, what do each of these mean? Then we've got who these people are. Ooh, I don't like how it's worth 1 point. Hang on, let me change something right quick. Because I don't like this. Yeah, it'll be fun. I can change it later. Or leave it. It's not that big of a deal. It's just going to bother me. So I should probably read the whole thing, I assume. Yep. All right. In 1917, an event occurred which Germans hoped would alter the course of the war. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia abdicated in March. His resignation led to Russia's withdrawal from the war 9 months later. So that is this guy here. And then his wife, and then his mostly daughters and one son. So abdicated. That's going to be resigned. And also here, Nicholas II is the Tsar, last Tsar of Russia. Okay. When World War I broke out, Russia honored its obligation to France and joined the fight against the Central Powers. The Russian army fought bravely, but poor leadership, defeats, and desertions undermined the army's morale and determination. In addition, Russia had been plagued for centuries by corruption, poverty, and peasant uprisings, and it was ripe for revolution. Appeals to the Tsar for permanent reforms were ignored. Consequently, on March 18, 1917, Nicholas II was forced to give up the throne, ending 300 years of Romanov rule. A democratic, provisional, so temporary, government under Alexander Kerensky took control of the nation. So we got provisional. Provisional is temporary. And Kerensky is leader of democratic provisional government. All right, let's see. The Russian people are suffering from economic fatigue and from disillusionment with the Allies. The world thinks the Russian Revolution is at an end. Do not be mistaken. The Russian Revolution is just beginning. That was him, and he was right. Kerensky did his best to keep Russia in the war while implementing democratic reforms. However, the provisional government was out of touch with Russia's peasants and workers, who demanded even more radical changes. On November 7th, 1917, Kerensky's government was overthrown and replaced by a government led by Vladimir Lenin. When Lenin came to power, the Bolshevik communist revolution began. This revolution turned Russia into a dictatorial state. That's this guy here, Lenin. This is going to lead to, both of these two are going to be part of this revolution, and both of them are going to try to get power, and this one's going to end up dead. Pretty much is how that's going to work. So Bolshevik is communist, and Lenin is leader of Bolshevik revolution and dictator of Russia. All right. Lenin soon arranged for an armistice agreement with Germany that removed Russia from the war. The armistice became official in March 1918 with the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Russia's withdrawal enabled the Germans to shift more than 1 million troops from the Eastern Front to the west for one final offensive maneuver in 1918. All right, so armistice is agreement. Can somebody put the link in the chat? Thank you. Alright, so we got 3 from the video. So according to the video, Lenin lost the election, but he refused to give up his position.
1894, and Nicholas II has just been coronated as the Emperor of Russia. Before continuing, there's a technical matter which needs to be resolved, the calendar. To simplify, the Russian calendar was 13 days behind the Gregorian calendar in use today, which is why some things like the October Revolution are said to have occurred in November. For this episode, both calendars will be used. So, Nicholas II was an absolute monarch, which meant that he had the final say on everything concerning the Russian Empire, which was huge. During the late 19th century, Russia had seen rapid industrialization. Alongside this came new ideas, such as the communist ideals of a certain Karl Marx, which led to the working class of Russia demanding greater representation. So, to grossly oversimplify, communism is a political ideology which argues that the means of production, such as factories, should be collectively owned by everyone as opposed to individuals. It wanted to abolish social classes and believed that the economy should be entirely controlled by the central government. The Imperial Russian government suffered from being somewhat distant and incompetent. For example,
so let me pause right there. Remember, the idea of communism is, especially if you have a poor, lower and working class or middle class, then they're going to be like, yeah, equality, like, from the government sounds really good, you know, when you're starving. So that's when people tend to start banding together for things like communism and allowing dictatorships, especially if they're working. All right, let me continue.
Agriculture was slow to industrialize, and there were numerous foreign policy failures. The most notable of these failings were the ones which caused conflict with the Japanese, leading to the 1904 Russo-Japanese War. So, to simplify, the reasons for war can largely be chalked up to Japan expanding its influence in Korea, and Russia refused to accept it. The Japanese decided the war would settle it, so launched a sneak attack against the Russian fleet in Port Arthur, which Russia had leased from China. The Japanese would continue with a string of victories, such as the Battle of Mukden and the Battle of Tsushima. This embarrassed the Russians, and during peace negotiations led by a certain Sergei Witte, Russia lost Port Arthur and half of here. Unfortunately for Russia, military defeat wasn't their only problem at this time. The most notable event was called Bloody Sunday, in which a priest called Father Gapon led a procession through Russia's capital St. Petersburg to present a petition to the emperor. The crowd was fired upon, leading to hundreds of deaths, which then caused riots across the empire. Witte was tasked with ending the rioting and presented a compromise, the formation of political parties and...
This is a huge deal. So, they went to protest, and essentially they got like scared. They're like, oh no, they're coming for us. And it was like, dude, chill. Like, and once you start shooting protesters, it like goes bad. So then they get upset. You know, shooting people makes people upset.
And an elected assembly called the Duma. For the record, this Duma was mostly useless, since it had no authority, and Nicholas II could still do whatever he wanted. There were some elections, and the emperor appointed a new prime minister, Pyotr Stolypin. Stolypin would bring about much-needed agricultural reform before being assassinated in a theatre in 1911, in front of the emperor. 1914 was a big year for Russia, since St. Petersburg was renamed to Petrograd because it sounded more Russian. Another event which was also probably important was the First World War, in which Russia had mixed success. to raise morale and against the advice of literally everyone, Nicholas appointed himself as the head of the army. He left his wife, Empress Alexandra, in charge of the capital with her advisor, Grigory Rasputin. After Russia's failings on the Eastern Front, Rasputin was...
So that was, bad. Bad. Especially, like, Rasputin is one of those, like, characters in history that, like, everybody remembers. Also, because they put him in, a movie, and it painted him pretty badly. But he was kind of a crazy person, so, I mean, there was that. So, but leaving her in charge while she's following, like, a crazy person is probably not going to make people happy.
Was blamed for corrupting the royal family, was eventually assassinated in 1916. Nicholas, as the head of the army, was seen as responsible for the failures of the war. War fatigue and food shortages led to protests, which Nicholas had hoped to put down with the army. Well, the army mutinied and joined the protesters. In order to calm the situation, the Russian generals met with Nicholas and urged him to abdicate, which he did in 1917. Nicholas's abdication led to certain exiled people...
Pause on something. Alright, just wanted to make sure.
Most notably Vladimir Lenin returning to Russia. It was people like Lenin who undermined the new provisional government by forming a rival, the Petrograd Soviet. Lenin immediately began calling for the overthrow of the provisional government, promising the Russian people...
So it looks like we have Trotsky right here. I have no idea who that is, and that looks like Stalin.
Land, food, and an end to the war. The provisional government had decided not to end the war, and many people took to the streets to protest, and at the front of this protest stood Lenin's communist faction called the Bolsheviks. The government forces decided to open fire, and many prominent Bolsheviks, such as Leon Trotsky, were arrested, and Lenin was forced to flee to Finland. Trotsky wouldn't spend long in prison. The new Russian Prime Minister, Alexander Kerensky, appointed a new head of the army, Levir Kornilov. Kerensky and Kornilov quickly fell out, and Kornilov marched his troops on Petrograd. Kerensky released many of the Bolsheviks, their military arm. The Red Guard were the only ones that could stop Kornilov. Kornilov never reached Petrograd due to Bolshevik sabotage and was later arrested. Lenin returned to Russia and, in a shocking turn of events, called for the overthrow of the government. This time, the overthrow was to be violent. Lenin placed Trotsky in command of the revolution. The Bolsheviks seized city infrastructure, Kerensky fled, and shortly afterwards the Bolsheviks seized the Winter Palace, the seat of the Russian government. Lenin then declared to the Petrograd Soviet that the Bolsheviks were now in control and Trotsky dismissed their opponents. Immediately after the revolution, Lenin announced 3 decrees. There was the decree on peace, which promised to put an end to the war, the decree on land, which abolished private land ownership and allowed peasants to divide land amongst themselves, and the decree on workers, which introduced a minimum wage. Lenin also brought in universal healthcare and education, increased the rights of women, alongside accepting Finland's Declaration of Independence. The Bolsheviks announced that there would be free and fair elections the next month, which the Bolsheviks lost. This was not what Lenin had planned, so he ordered the Red Guard to shut down the elected assembly and had himself placed in charge. Moscow was declared...
Alright, so there's our first. According to the video, Lenin lost the election, but he refused to give up his position. Oh, no, true. I'll put the other ones in the chat after we're done. According to the video, the Reds were made of liberals, Tsarets, nationalists, conservatives, and the Allied powers.
Led Russia's new capital, Lenin switched to the Gregorian calendar. In the March of 1918, after some tough negotiations and an invasion, Trotsky and a team of delegates managed to secure a humiliating peace with the Central Powers. This treaty, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, gave up all of this territory to Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, although they themselves would be forced to give this up in the Treaty of Versailles. To many in Russia, this peace was long overdue. To others, such as the Czechoslovakian Legion, it was a complete betrayal. The Czechoslovakian Legion had fought for Russia in the First World War in return for Czechoslovakian independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. After peace was declared, they revolted. Their initial success spurred other enemies of the Bolsheviks to take up arms as well, thus beginning the Russian Civil War in earnest. In terms of the faction, the Bolsheviks and their supporters are called the Reds, those who opposed them are known as the Whites. Britain, France, Japan and the United States elected to intervene on the side of the Whites. It was mostly to reopen the Eastern Front against Germany, but there was also a great worry about the spread of communism. The Whites were initially very successful, but it wasn't long before their progress stalled. This was because they weren't very unified, and many of the...
Alright, so let's see. So the next one's going to be false, because it was the Whites that were nationalists, Tsars, liberals, conservatives, and Allied powers, and the Reds were communists, socialists, and anarchists. So this one is false. According to the video, Trotsky was victorious against Stalin in the battle for power.
Those fighting against the Bolsheviks were fighting for their own independence, not to restore the Russian Empire. The white generals were also somewhat useless. For example, Alexander Kolchak struggled to keep his officers sober, insulted his allies, and executed tens of thousands of people, turning them to the Bolshevik cause. He did manage to capture Yekaterinburg, where the former emperor was being held. The Bolsheviks didn't want the emperor to fall into enemy hands, so he and his family were executed on July 17, 1918. The Reds had the advantage of geography. Their territory was much more compact and had greater levels of industrialization. It had better infrastructure, lines of communication, raw materials, and a larger population. To maintain order in this area, the Bolsheviks began what is called the Red Terror. This involved sending dissidents to work camps, shooting protesters, and Trotsky holding the families of generals hostage so they'd stay loyal. Eventually, it became clear to the Allies that the Bolsheviks were going to win. The Allies withdrew, and the Czechoslovakian leader returned to Czechoslovakia, which was independent by then anyway. The collapse of the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires meant that many peoples in Eastern Europe were looking to establish their own nations and borders. The Polish, led by Józef Piłsudski, wanted to expand the newly independent Poland at the cost of Russia. At the same time, the Bolsheviks were also looking to spread communism to their neighbours and reconquer Russia's old territory. The Bolsheviks also believed that the turmoil in Germany, the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, meant that communist governments could be set up there as well. In 1919, the Polish invaded Ukraine and captured Kiev. The Bolsheviks counterattacked, forced the Polish all the way back to Warsaw. The Polish repulsed the attack, thus maintaining their independence and stopping Bolshevik forces from entering Germany. These borders were established, with Ukraine and Belarus becoming socialist republics, which were essentially Russian puppet states. Having failed to spread communism to Eastern Europe, for now, the Bolsheviks moved to secure their position in Russia. Lenin turned to fixing Russia's economic woes by implementing the new economic policy. This allowed some private enterprise, a distinctly non-Bolshevik ideal, to help revitalize the economy. In 1922, Russia and its surrounding socialist republics, which were nothing more than puppet states, agreed to form the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Lenin had become unwell during the early 1920s, and after a series of struggles...
So, know that the USSR is going to come up in the Cold War, and that's what we'll be calling Russia at that time. And also in World War II, we'll be calling it that as well.
Was left bedridden until his death in 1924. Lenin's death left a power vacuum which only two men could fill. The first was Trotsky, the second was a certain Joseph Stalin. Stalin had played a role in the Russian Revolution prior to this, first as an editor of the Bolshevik newspaper and also as a commander in the Red Army during the invasion of Poland. By the time of Lenin's death, Stalin held the position of General Secretary, the highest political post in the USSR. Stalin was able to forge alliances with other prominent party members and concealed Lenin's criticisms of him. So Trotsky and Stalin held two distinct positions of how to proceed. Trotsky's position is known as permanent revolution. Trotsky felt that unless socialist revolution was encouraged in other countries, the Bolsheviks' revolution would halt and it would become impossible for the Soviet Union to survive. Whereas Stalin's belief, known as socialism in one country, argued that socialism within the USSR should be strengthened before it could be exported anywhere else. So, long story short, Stalin was victorious in the struggle for power, and in 1929 Trotsky was exiled from the Soviet Union. He ended up in Mexico, where he was assassinated in 1940. After his victory, Stalin began to...
So that was a big thing, was Stalin had his secret police send people after Trotsky. Alright, I'm gonna stop the video there.